I want to welcome you to a recipe for award-winning online community engagement with our special guests, Via and Ariano. We're really excited to have you. The participation and the enthusiasm around this session has been great, and I know that you're going to really enjoy the presentation on the case study. I'm going to begin with a little overview of what we have learned over the years in terms of best practices for online engagement, and that's going to feed into making the case study a little bit more meaningful because I think that this case study has really done a great job of following best practices in terms of online community engagement. So I wanted to begin with this context here. For years, we have been dealing with public meetings, and we've got a special name for these folks. We call these people the STP. They are the same 10 people that end up showing up to everything. And it's either, it seems like this situation where we're trying to figure out what angle to take the picture from to make it seem like we've got a great turnout, or sometimes this happens where people are all fired up and usually not for good reasons. It's within this context that the American Planning Association and several other agencies approached us because we have a long history with online community engagement. They asked us to look across multiple case studies to try to give some advice on how online tools are being most helpful and also what we can do to make projects as successful as possible. So what are the key aspects of projects? So one of the first things that we did is now we've looked at over 225 different case studies, and we asked each agency that was being interviewed the same question: what do you mean by successful? And we heard some common themes coming out of that. The first one is the quantity of engagement. Not only do they want to engage more people than are typically participating in their efforts, but they wanted to make sure to engage a much broader demographic than tends to be showing up. The second aspect is really about the quality of engagement. Not only do they want more people from a broader demographic, but they want to make sure that the information coming in is informed, that people are aware of the trade-offs associated with different choices and the complexities around planning, the constraints and so forth, and that the information coming in is actionable, i.e. That we can make conclusions about what people think, 4 out of 5 people and so forth. It's very, very difficult when collecting, for example, open-ended comments to make any real conclusions about what the patterns of thinking are around the options. Out of this research, I want to highlight 7 key lessons that have emerged. And I don't want you to feel like you need to be taking notes. I'm going to share with you after the session a guide that we created out of this research that's got all this information and some additional information as well. Now, the first message coming out of this is the need to design for the unmotivated. There's always going to be people who are positive about your agency and people who are negative about whatever it is that's going on. The reality is that the vast majority of people are in the middle with more moderate attitudes. It turns out that this really affects people's motivation. The people who are most motivated are the people who are motivated typically by anger or fear about what is coming at them. The people who are least motivated are actually people who are kind of in the middle but leaning towards the positive. These people, as if you can imagine, are satisfied with your agency and what's going on. They don't care that much about the issues. They're not really fired up about it. These people are perhaps the most interesting to engage because they have the most input about what nuances you can put on the plan in order to make it more interesting and more exciting for them. I almost think of it like, you're trying to get a squirrel to eat out of your hand, and anything that you do to wave them off is going to be going to scare people away. Now, the second message is kind of feeds into that. Aim for about a 5-minute experience. If you ask people for more than 5 minutes, you see that the participation drops off very, very dramatically. In fact, you lose about 75% of the audience by asking for 10 minutes of somebody's time. So very, very challenging. And it's interesting to note that when you ask for 3 minutes, you don't actually get that much benefit. So 5 minutes tends to be around the right number to ask for in terms of people's time to get the most input from people. But that's really challenging because we've got a lot we want to get done in 5 minutes. The third message is do not require registration. If you can choose an online system that does not require people to register before they participate, you will engage about 10 times more people just by making that change. It turns out that about 1 out of 10 people will actually register. 9 out of 10 will say, you know what, I'm not that interested, I'm not going to do that. And you'll lose a great deal of audience that way. The fourth message is try to use as many different ways that people can participate as possible. Now, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. 80% of your participation in these sort of efforts will occur either on people using the web or smartphones. In fact, more than half of this crowd here are going to be using smartphones. So not only does your software need to work on a smartphone, it should be delightful on a smartphone. Thirdly, kiosks and tablets and that sort of thing are a great way to kind of fill in some of those gaps, the 20%, the people that are difficult to reach. Putting these kiosks in, for example, community centers or recreation centers where people are waiting for their children to get changed has been a really great resource for us at MetroQuest and for many in terms of engaging people online. Even if people don't have connectivity or devices, it allows them to participate, and you can kind of target where you're missing people and put these in different locations and really engage anywhere from 200 to 500 people per day if they're in the right location. Using tablets and laptops and that sort of thing in a kind of a roving show, showing up at other people's meetings and having a table around your project is also a really successful way of, again, targeting some of those underrepresented populations by going to existing events. So the more you can diversify how people can participate, the better you will reach that broad demographic. Now, number 5, make it insightful and delightful. So this is about trying to create a bit of a learning experience, but also making sure that it's fun for people. The difference between kind of a multiple choice experience and something that's visual and interactive, about 7.5 times more participation. And this is primarily because people will recommend it to their friends if it's fun and interesting. If it kind of feels like homework, then not many people are going to do that. So I wanted to give you a few examples from our own portfolio just to kind of make this a little bit more real for you of how, given some ideas to you about how you could make it insightful and delightful. So I'm just going to toggle over here to a browser where I've got a few different configurations opened up. And the first one I'm going to show was actually used by our special guest today via Metropolitan Transit. This was for a long-range plan. And the welcome screen, as you can imagine, just gives people some high-level information and encourages them to begin. Now, this button here allows people to toggle back and forth to the language of their choice. The first real interactive question is what is important to you? This is probably the most important question to begin with. Because it really sets the stage for people that it's about them and their own priorities. So here we can just go in and create our own preferred list of what the top priorities for improving the transportation is. Simple as that. Then we've got a few questions around things like the quality of service, where you can answer a few questions about what would make it a better quality of service for you, what would make it work better for you. And finally, when people come in, they just see the boundary area, or if it's a corridor study, they'll see lines on a map and so forth. And you can zero in on any issues that you want to identify and provide them on the map for example, where you travel to, where there's improvements that are needed, for example, in the transit system, and place comments all over this map. The last step is typically tell us a little bit more about yourself. Now, remember I said don't require people to register. At this stage, they've already kind of gotten engaged. They're interested in the process. They will give you their information at the end because they know what's at stake. They know that they're curious about getting the results, and they'll provide this information at the end. 5 minutes before, if you had have started with this to say, before you get in, we want your personal information, most people wouldn't have provided it. So that's the configuration that was used in our case study today. I want to just show you a few other examples of how we've adopted this kind of insightful and delightful attitude. For example, this one here is a corridor study in Texas, and it allows people to do a quick little visual preference survey about what they like and dislike about different aspects of, for example, in this case, bike and ped facilities, landscaping, public art. This could be really about anything. This one here, moving over to Arizona for a few case studies. This one here is a traffic study to improve the traffic in Sedona. I like this screen, which gives people some really quick strategies to consider and allows them to evaluate a number of different strategies for improving a range of conditions in Sedona. This one is a statewide plan, and I chose this one as an example because I thought this was a really interesting step here. It allows people to allocate the annual budget for transportation improvements, and you see that there's already some budget that's been allocated, and you can allocate the remaining budget to different areas. And this is a really fun step for people, but it also influences them in terms of their understanding about scarcity and trade-offs and so forth. I thought that was a really interesting way of kind of having people do something fun and interactive, but also having them learn something about what's being faced. And this last screen here for this configuration allows people to actually evaluate certain trade-offs that are being considered throughout the state. For example, the balance between maintaining the existing roads or providing more roads. Where do you sit on that spectrum? Would you rather provide more roads and risk having the existing roads deteriorate, or do you want to put more emphasis on maintaining the existing roads? A very, very realistic choice, again, presented in a fun way for people, so you're kind of informing and engaging at the same time. This screen here I thought was quite interesting. It allowed people to look at a variety of different corridors and pick corridors for investment. And you see this down here is adding up how much I've allocated. This could be a budget or it could be number of projects, but it really gives people an interactive way of evaluating where their priorities ought to be, and it provides some constraints into that process. The last one I'll show just very quickly is using the scenario screen, which is another great way of kind of educating people about the pros and cons of alternatives while you're engaging them. So this is a corridor study in Phoenix, and it presented with people with a number of different scenarios. And you see, as I click through these different scenarios, the pros and cons of these alternatives are shown to me. This one does really well on my top 3 priorities and poorly on my 4th top priority. So if I say, yes, I like this particular alternative, what I'm saying is I'm aware that there's a trade-off here, but I like the benefits. And that's a really high quality input because people are aware that there's pros and cons to the alternatives. So those were some examples that I thought kind of brought to light this insightful and delightful point here. The next point that I'll make is really the importance of promotion. And our special guests are going to talk about this today. You've got essentially 5 seconds to get somebody's attention, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or anything else. And if you get their attention, then perhaps you get 5 minutes of their time. And if you treat them well during that 5 minutes, if it's interesting and fun and meaningful for them, then they'll go ahead and tell 50 friends. And that's how you go from a small group of people participating to a very large group. This is one of my favorite campaigns recently that we've worked on for Nashville, and it allowed people to just sort of learn about the project in these quick little visuals. All right, Nashville, it's time to pick, and it was a really fun way of just getting their attention, and then they go to the survey. So this other one came out, and this next one is the one that just made it go nuts on the internet. All of a sudden, participation just spiked when this came out, and it was all of a sudden everywhere. The last point that I'll make is the need to monitor and adjust as you go along. You're going to always have gaps in your participation, and it's important to monitor that along the way. See who you're missing, and then use some targeted strategies to fill in some of those gaps. So there are our top lessons as we look through these 225 case studies. Again, I'll be sharing with you the report that goes into more detail. I wanted to just highlight a few points about one of the case studies that we looked at that I think was exceptional, and this was done in Atlanta. They used the media to the greatest extent possible. The media is actually looking for stories like this, and as soon as they talked about the process on the 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock news, all of a sudden people started really participating in large numbers. They also created a share kit, which is essentially sample tweets, sample Facebook posts, and sample blog stories, and they sent them around to people in the community that they knew were bloggers and the leads of different community organizations. And so the voice was really coming from them. They could just take the sample posts, edit a few things, add some graphics, and share them quickly. So that really managed to, spread the word very, very quickly. And they also did a good job of kind of monitoring by zip code where they were hearing from, where they were underrepresented, and they took their show on the road to go to community events in targeted areas to fill in some of those gaps. And they did, a whole range of other strategies to try to get people to participate, just kind of where they were, wandering by, dots on images and so forth. There's all kinds of ways to use kind of pop-up engagement to engage people as they're passing by. The last point I'll make here is the need to understand, I think, that the engagement process doesn't end when you stop wanting information from the community. It ends when you communicate back to the people who have participated, here's what we heard, and here's how it affected the outcome, because that really reinforces the value of engagement for people. And I think it creates a culture of community engagement that builds in your communities. In this particular process, they engaged over 25,000 people. So a wonderful outcome, and I think testament to the range of different promotional strategies and the thought that they put into their public engagement process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our special guest today. I want to introduce Hannah Santiago, who's a strategic planner too at via Metropolitan Transit, and along with her, Chester Britt is joining us, who is a project director at Ariano Associates that helped out on the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dave, for a great introduction. Today I'm here to talk about the case study, and essentially I'll cover 3 topics, give you a little context to our region and the growth in our planning framework, then talk a little bit about the planning process with a focus on our public engagement strategies, and then briefly at the end I'll hit on lessons learned. So our region is expected to grow by 1.6 million people in the next 25 years. This is a significant amount of people. It equals to be about 146 new residents each and every day. Via Metropolitan Transit is located in San Antonio, Texas, in Bexar County. We are going to experience significant changes to our freeway congestion. Travel by car is going to take much longer. Our speeds are going to decrease. This affects our entire system, including our transit trips. And in San Antonio, in comparison to other Texas cities, we spend a higher percentage of our household income on transportation, almost 1 out of every $4. Our region also invests less in public transportation. You can see here, compared to our Texas peers, our federal funding and local funding per capita is significantly less. A little information about VIA. We have 14 member cities, the largest one being the city of San Antonio. We serve over 1,200 square miles in service area and 1.7 million in population today. We have a fleet of 450 buses, 92 routes, 7,200 bus stops. We are all bus system. Now, walking through the planning process, essentially this was 18 months. It started in February of 2015. And with our partners at Cambridge Systematics and multiple other firms like Arianos and Associates and some other local and national firms helping us design this process, we wanted to make sure that our public engagement was aligned with our technical development and that essentially we were getting guidance from the community along the way. So the first third, we were really focused on understanding the need. And from the public's perspective, we wanted to know what elements of transit are most important to the region. And then as we move forward into the second phase, we were asking, where should these future transit investments go? Finally, we were asking which investments are most important. And you can see there was a line up with kind of the milestones that we were trying to define throughout the planning process. Our fourth and final phase was the final plan review. So we heard from over 11,000 people in comments, surveys, emails. We had 11,000 people subscribe to our email list. And we were at over 270 events. Some of these were VIA hosted events, but many of them were already established events where we had a table or a booth, made a presentation, or showed up to ask for people to complete surveys or give us comments. Our effort was an agency's priority, so it wasn't just from the strategic planning department. We had help from our operators, from marketing, from engineering, strategic planning, local government, customer relations. All sorts of people were involved in helping us reach out to our community and get some great input throughout the different phases. So jumping into the first phase, we used MetroQuest for this one. Got over 4,000 respondents. We had this tool in English and in Spanish. And we also had hard paper copies that we distributed and used as a tool as we went around to ask people to complete those surveys in person. We used both the online version and the paper survey version. We went to people. You can see here we're showing people how to use iPads and asking people to fill out surveys while they were waiting. Our team was very strategic. They found events where people had to stand in line and where they wouldn't mind taking up 8 minutes to complete our survey. The second phase, we had promotional things. This is a free 31-day pass, which is a great incentive for a lot of our bus riders. we used Google Docs, Google Forms as our online piece of this, and then we also had the paper version in both English and Spanish. And our third phase, we did a joint survey with another regional planning effort called SA Tomorrow, which was the City of San Antonio's comprehensive planning process. That was powerful because we had multiple agencies out there pushing and promoting this survey. We did a bus wrap and used this to go into neighborhoods where we were missing certain demographics and used that to make sure that we were reaching people who are not normally involved in planning efforts. And then finally, together, final comments on the plan, we used the interactive map where people could leave us comments and explore the recommended system. This is a transit meetup, our marketing promotions. It's an innovative concept where people come for a casual conversation at a restaurant or local hangout, and it's a pretty fun environment. We also had the long-range plan document available for people. It was a very visual and graphic document, very public-friendly, and we reiterated how the plan reflected what we heard from across the community. So one of the important pieces of our engagement was tracking the demographics, and Dave mentioned this, but we wanted to make sure that we were hearing from a representative-ish sample and from all areas of our community. So every week when we got updated numbers on the surveys, we also had updated demographics to see where we were over sampling and where we needed some additional outreach efforts, and this really helped. So that first map was our first round, and we did the same tracking for the second round of surveys and then the third. Our Board of Trustees and other stakeholders found this information very useful when they were considering the results that we were reporting. We also tracked other demographics like Dave showed on our tool, like age and education, and whether or not people use VIA currently. There's a difference between someone who knows the system very well and someone who's never used it. And this was very interesting, especially when we got to the implementation priority questions to understand what the priorities are for existing riders and for people who have sometimes used the system, or for those people who have never used the system. So it kind of gave us some extra context into the respondents and the strategies that they were recommending. So with all this effort, we were really able to ensure that our plan was reflective of the community's priorities, and the resulting plan ended up in three major elements. 1, a better bus system, 2, rapid transit network, and 3, innovative solutions. So the better bus system, I believe, was major as the outcome of the major input we heard from existing bus riders. People recognize the need for better street lighting, better crosswalks and sidewalks, more frequent buses. We heard from a lot of people that our bus system is just fine. Don't tweak it. We really want maybe improve the span of service, give us late night service. But we have a whole element that is associated with all of trying to respond to all of the recommendations that we heard from the community about how important our bus system is. And then we have a forward-looking element, the rapid transit network, and this is high-capacity transit options like bus rapid transit, light rail transit, and express buses in HOVs. And this element responds to a need in our community to focus on high-growth corridors and connecting major activity centers. And then the third element is all about creating a seamless transportation system, integrating with our partners' initiatives, transit-supportive land uses, but then also the car sharing, bike sharing, multimodal trip planning apps, kind of looking at the transportation system as a whole seamless system and not just one provider providing connections to another mode of transit. So our plan ended up with 41 frequent routes that arrive every 15 minutes or better. This plan provides frequent service to 1.7 million people in 2040. We have 11 express routes, 5 primo routes, which is a high-frequency bus route, and 7 bus rapid transit and light rail corridors, and then longer hours of service. It's a big, bold plan, and it's reflective of what the community demands in the future. So some quick lessons learned. We realized that the tools that were more fun and the shorter they were got a lot better response. We had a little friendly competition with our friends at the City of San Antonio with their planning processes. They were doing surveys too, so we always wanted to check their numbers and see if we were competitive or if we were going to top their outreach efforts. And we also internally, with all those different departments, we would go out to transit centers and park and rides and had competitions of which department could get more surveys. And so knowing your community is also critical. We wanted to make sure that all of our material was in both English and Spanish, and we received quite a bit of Spanish engagement throughout the planning process. And it was great to have the demographics come in every week so we knew who we were hearing from and who we were not, so we could adjust our campaign accordingly. And finally, the best advice I have for major outreach initiatives is go to them. We did have some VIA-hosted open houses, and it was, I wish I remember that phrase, Dave, but the same 10 people. And we really heard from a lot of people who don't typically engage in planning processes just because we went to events where we already knew there was going to be people. And that was a great strategy. So thank you. From here, I will hand it over to Chester.
All right, thanks, Hannah. I am Chester. I'm the project director at Arellano Associates, and we've had the good fortune of working with both MetroQuest extensively on a number of projects and also working specifically with VIA on the program that you just saw Hannah give a case study on. And I just want to start off by saying that, that VIA program is a tremendous case study as an example of what you could do for outreach in a dynamic way. And what I'm going to try to do is show you and talk about the paradigm shift that is happening in public outreach. And I don't want you to be intimidated by what VIA did in the sense that it was a very comprehensive program that involved a lot of moving pieces and a lot of tools, and they did a tremendous job. But there are things that you can do along the way that don't require you to have the entire amount of resources that VIA had for that program and still begin to move towards a more dynamic approach. So there is really a paradigm shift going on in public outreach over the last, I would say, 5 years. And it's moving from a static two-dimensional approach to a more interactive three-dimensional approach. And what I mean by that is, the old way of doing notification, communication tools, meetings, and reports and documentation was really has been historically kind of a one-directional of giving information out and not really having a lot of ability to receive input other than public input received at public meetings, and then people also being able to potentially send in letters and things like that. The more interactive approach that we're going to explore today is really focused on a more three-dimensional approach where you're engaging people at every step of the process, even in notification. And that is going to create a situation where people are going to be able to provide you good information at every step of the way, and not just at the period where you're having your public meetings. So if you can go to the next slide, Hannah. I want to start by talking about notification. In the static 2D approach, you're going to have what we sometimes still use as your public postcard that gets mailed out and maybe newspaper ads. That's pretty typical for a standard community outreach program. And the case study that I want to show you is one that we had to do for a project where they did not want a three-dimensional approach, and they wanted to send out direct mail, and we did. We spent $16,000 doing that. And we also put some ads in a paper, and we had 20 people attend our meeting. And there's another project that we did where it was more of a three-dimensional approach where you're using e-blasts and you're doing Facebook ads and you're boosting posts that you have posted on your own Facebook page. And that basically was a lot less expensive. We spent $300 for Facebook boost posts and then $700 for Facebook ads. And you could see the reach there. We reached 66,000 people on the boost post and 71,000 on the Facebook ad. We had an average of 30 people attend the meetings, and on the face of it, you might think, well, wow, that's not really that much different. But what really happened and what we saw was there was a 450% increase in website traffic after we did the Facebook ad. We received almost 2,500 link clicks, and we received 54 Facebook comments as part of the post. So even though we didn't have a tremendous difference in the number of people that participated, we had a way higher level of people engaging the project both through the website and also posting comments. It is hard to get to meetings, so sometimes people in some of these busy corridors that we were working in, it wasn't convenient for them to attend the meetings. And so the lesson learned here is that we're going to be doing some of the things I'll be showing you next, which is to do live webcasts of meetings and things like that. The communication tools, the static approach is typically the things that you see in all projects, which are your standard fact sheets, your FAQs, maybe project maps, comment cards, and maybe a hard copy survey. The three-dimensional approach that you're seeing more and more of is infographics, where people are able to engage them. But there's also a lot of online tools like ArtStory, which we use for VIA, to tell a story about a given area so that people begin to understand what it is that they're looking at and understanding what the project's about, so that when they give you input, that it's valuable input. We also use the interactive map with VIA, which you see on the screen on the bottom right, which is also a tool that allows people to engage the map and not just look at a static map, where they can geocode comments onto the map and they can click on elements of the map and drill down into the map and get useful information, and the map reorients itself. And you can also have other map features where you can show land use layers and bus connectivity or bike networks and other important geographic things on the map that would relate to your project. And then there's MetroQuest, which Dave has done a great job of showing already, but that's another online engagement tool where we've seen tremendous results, where thousands of people participate, where you would never get that level of participation if you were just using your static 2D approach. The next element is your actual meetings themselves, and we've all been to the meetings where you have 20 or 30 people come, you have an array of boards on easels at the perimeter of the room, and then maybe you give a short PowerPoint presentation. The three-dimensional approach or interactive approach is really about having layers of ways of people engaging you at the meeting itself. You could have portable kiosks with live web feeds of either a website or a MetroQuest survey or an interactive map, or any of those things. If you're connected to the internet, you can toggle between those using an iPad and a portable kiosk. We're also using interactive displays more and more, where instead of having a static board, you actually have a TV that can interact with the person and have levels of information in it related to topics such as right-of-way or alignments. So you're not just looking at one image, you can toggle through a display of images. We're also doing live webcasts of meetings, which is another very powerful thing, where you have people that are limited in their ability to get to your meetings because of time, the distances they need to travel, and just the commitment level after working all day of doing that, actually going to a meeting. You can participate in the live webcast virtually online while the meeting is going on. But the real value of these is that you can post those as a recorded meeting after the meeting's over, and people for months can be going to look at that. In our Google Analytics, we've really figured out that within 3 or 4 months, we typically get 300 or 400 people that are looking at our meetings. And I kind of call it the Netflix analogy, which is that people used to have to race home to watch their favorite sitcom at a certain given day and time, but that is no longer the case, and people are expecting to be able to go onto an online system like Netflix and to look at something when it's convenient for them to look at it, and that's how they're looking at public meetings as well. If you provide that as an option, people are willing to do that. And then instant polling, having things like Turning Point or Poll Anywhere. There's a lot of different tools out there where you can actually do preference surveys live with an audience in the public, and they can vote on things, and the results appear on the screen. And then finally, you're reporting out. Typically, after a meeting or at the end of a project, you'll have a standard textual hard copy report, which sits on a shelf, and not very many people are willing to look at it. But we've been more and more doing online publishing. There's a lot of online publishing tools where you can very graphically display an executive summary of what the report is telling you. You saw Hannah show you an infographic of what the results were of the efforts that they did, and it's really a powerful way of really communicating what is the final result of your product and allowing people to engage it dynamically online. We can also do streaming of the live meetings, which I already talked about, and what a great way of having people just continue to participate in your meeting, essentially, even months afterwards. There's also things like interactive dashboards, which are basically a PDF document that's hyperlinked to organize all of the information related to your project, whether it be a video or a PowerPoint or a document or an online tool like MetroQuest, or any other level or type of information can be tied to that single file. So instead of sending out an e-blast that has 20 attachments and 3 paragraphs of text, and the user cringes when they open that because they don't know what to do with all that, and they know it's going to take them a long time to sort through that. This is a very graphic way of encapsulating an entire project into one spot, and you can hand it out as on a flash drive. You can post it on a website. You can embed it in an email. You can put it on a portable kiosk at a meeting, and it's interactive and allows people to just touch and go and be hyperlinked to those documents. And then Google Analytics is another very powerful way of reporting out what's going on with your projects. When we did the interactive maps for our clients, we noticed that people were spending upwards of 4 to 5 minutes on the map, where we know from our other evaluations of other projects, when you have a static map, people maybe spend less than 15 seconds looking at your page. And so allowing people to interact with the products really captures their attention and really allows them to focus in on what it is that you're doing and to provide more meaningful input, as opposed to a more static approach where people kind of flip through a report and they really don't pay attention because it's not engaging them. So that's really, I think, the end of my presentation. I just wanted to, kind of bring it all together, which is you saw really 2 great presentations by both Dave and Hannah that really talked specifically about MetroQuest as a tool, and then also via how they incorporated a lot of the tools I just explained into one program. But there are lots of examples where a client might not have the resources to do all the things that we showed, but even incorporating 1 or 2 of them really makes a big difference in terms of people wanting to understand your project and engaging with you in the process that you're going through.
Well, thank you very much, Chester. That was great, and also Hannah, great job going through your case study. That was really interesting for me, and such a wonderful case study that really touched on so many of the elements of the patterns of best practices that we found in our review of case studies. So it's really nice to see that in action in San Antonio. I'm going to start diving into the chat box and looking at some of these questions. So the first question here is, is there a rule of thumb on how much to budget for a comprehensive public outreach? Hannah, Chester, do you have a sense of that? I know it comes in all shapes and sizes depending on the size and the resources of the community, but is there a rule of thumb that you use at VIA?
We don't have a rule of thumb, but I think it would vary depending on the planning study. I would say
I have
anywhere from
Chester,
do you have an opinion? I was going to throw out 15 to 20% of your budget, total budget.
Yeah.
Is probably
that's exactly what I was going to say. Is it a rule of thumb? If people are looking for a rule of thumb, is typically around 15%. It does kind of depend on the nature and the type of a project. If it's a visioning program where you're needing to get a lot of community input, then it might be higher than 15%. If it's more of a CEQA, NEPA program where you're doing scoping meetings and public hearings and not a lot of additional outreach other than those community meetings, then it might be a little bit less than 15% or maybe right around 15%. But that is a rule of thumb. And I've also always thought of outreach as being like an accordion where, you know, you have a lot of the same elements in outreach, but it's scalable. So I have programs where the tasks are almost exactly the same that are $50,000, and other programs where it's $500,000. And you have databases where there's 100 people in it and others where there's 10,000 people in it. So it kind of is a scalable thing, but the elements are almost always the same in terms of, you know, notification, cloud of materials, public meetings, and engagement, and then reporting out. I mean, those are kind of the main staples of any communication program.
Right. Yeah, nicely done. I would echo that. I was going to say the same range, Hannah. It is like an accordion. I agree with that. The things like online engagement are relatively cost-effective per input, and so oftentimes the things that scale for smaller projects that have less resources are some of the face-to-face stuff, which can be quite costly on a kind of a per engagement basis. I think there's always a need for that kind of face-to-face, but the number of meetings often changes depending on the scale of the project. Next question here, what kind of programs did you use to develop the infographics? I know that Hannah, you said you had your consultant prepare those.
Yes, really talented graphic designers and very smart technical people who can collaborate. I think we had a great team over at Cambridge Systematics that developed all of these great visuals throughout the process, and Ariano and Associates also developed them. They could probably talk more about the specifics, but it was not a online kind of grab bag of things that already exist. They were custom infographics based on what we were trying to show, and that was a priority set from the very beginning of the planning process, and so we knew what we wanted, and they were able to find the resources to provide that.
Yeah, that's great. And they looked fantastic. So well done all around.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm not a graphic artist myself. Personally, we have a department that does that, but I do think that there are software tools out there that are specifically set up to do infographics. Infographics are kind of a tricky thing, honestly, and require a little level of technical understanding and in order to synthesize that information into graphic displays that kind of capture interest and also communicate information very quickly. They're very powerful, and obviously you can use standard Adobe tools like InDesign or Illustrator, which we use all the time as well. But I do think that there are specific tools out there that are kind of set up to do infographics, and there's like templates available where you can kind of pick through your templates depending on what kind of data you have. The data source is really the most important part of infographics. You have to have very strong data source in order to consolidate it into an infographic. Otherwise, you'll be fighting yourself the whole time.
Great.
Thanks. The next question here is, what could a municipality expect to pay for a subscription to MetroQuest? In the past, we have been pricing MetroQuest on a per project basis. So a project to develop MetroQuest for a process is $12,000. Just recently, we've started using annual subscriptions where you can use MetroQuest as much as you want and set it up for as many projects as you want, which lowers the cost per project down to just a few $1,000s per project, which most communities are opting for because of the cost per project so much lower for the annual subscription. So hopefully that gives you an idea. Certainly happy to chat with you. The cost for an annual subscription scales depending on the size of communities, so it's quite flexible for even the smaller communities. But happy to chat with you about what your needs are and what the scale of work that you do is. I don't want to go into too much detail because this is an informational, educational webinar, but happy to chat after that. And I'll have some contact information in the follow-up material that I can direct you to the right person on that. The next question here, and let's just take a couple more questions, and we'll answer all of the questions in the follow-up material. This next one I think is important to consider. Any thoughts on how these concepts scale down to small communities? Oftentimes on these webinars we have the best case studies, and it's wonderful when there's a large budget and you can do lots of different things in the public involvement process. I guess the question, another way of looking at this question is, if you were a small community, what's the best bang for the buck approaches among the different approaches that you had? How would you scale it down to try to get the most success out of a smaller budget? Hannah?
Well, that's a really hard question, and it's a case-by-case answer, I think. But I think, from our perspective, and many times we get asked to do exactly that on a project where a client will say, well, we have this much money, what should we do, or what could we do with the money that we have? And, it does depend on the nature of the project. If it's a, environmental process versus a planning process versus, a construction project, or what kind of outreach are we trying to do, and what is the purpose of the engagement? Is it to push information out, or is it to garner input back? And so it's hard to answer that question without knowing the actual project itself. But I do think, in my presentation, when we went through some of the things, you can see the cost difference, for example, of direct mail versus newspaper ads versus e-blast versus Facebook ads and posts. There's a need for all of them at some level. And, when you're affecting right away, you're going to need to make sure the property owners get something in the mail that notifies them. But there's also an opportunity with Facebook and other social media and e-blasts, and there's all kinds of vendors that can give you email addresses now. We're targeted around certain areas where you can really push out information at a very cost-effective way and allow people to kind of see what's going on with your project and self-select if they're interested in participating. And then when you get into the materials, printing materials is fairly expensive as well, and so a lot of these other tools that we're talking about can be put online, and really you don't have to pay for printing costs. So, if you're developing an ARC story or interactive map or infographics or whatever it is that you're doing, the cost of developing those kind of replaces the cost of printing, and they're way more powerful. So, I think it's kind of like it depends on the project, but I think there are different ways of doing things very cost effectively, and social media allows you to do that, especially in the notification where a lot of the costs historically come in getting the information out to people.
And I would just add one example. I was recently talking to a smaller community outside of the city of San Antonio, actually in an outlying county, and they were completing their comprehensive plan, and they had an free online survey or free web service to do the online survey, and they had 400 respondents, which was huge. And what they did is they had an iPad mini, and they were promoting it. They were out there talking to people to get them to fill out the survey, and the iPad incentive also helped. So I think that knowing your community and having face-to-face conversations to get people to give you input, you know your community better, you know where the events are, and I think that all of these strategies can be scaled, especially and tailored to any community.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Chester and Hannah, for your presentations today. It is the top of the hour. I want to respect people's time. Thank you so much for sticking around for a little bit of extra Q&A, folks. Apologize for going over time. Great job to our co-presenters, so thank you, Chester. Thank you, Hannah. And,
thank you, Dave.
Yeah,
my
pleasure. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I've already gotten 5 emails of kudos for the presentations and thanks. So thank you very much for the positive feedback, folks, and taking the time out to learn a little bit more about online community engagement. Take care, everyone.